So back in Unit 1, we had talked a little bit about this idea of like a market. That word kept coming up, and we talked about mixed market economies. We said a mixed market economy is an economy where the buyers and sellers are involved in making the decisions about how the society deals with those scarce resources. So we said those questions of, what will we produce, how will we produce, and for whom will we produce? That it's the buyers and sellers answering those questions. And when we ask ourselves, well, how is it that they answer those questions? Well, we see that happen through markets. A market is just any place that we see buyers and sellers interacting with one another. And that's actually going to be the big focus of Unit 2 for us. So Unit 2 is going to go through and discuss supply and demand, and using supply and demand. And through that mechanism, we can see how prices and quantities are established within a market. Now, to make sure we understand markets and how and why markets work, first we need to make sure we understand the idea of property rights, because markets can only function if those property rights exist. Where we see that the ownership of those resources, we want to understand how that is done, but also we want to make sure that people who own those resources or whatever it might be, those goods, that they have exclusive access to those things, right? We want to make sure that whenever you have ownership to a resource, you and you alone have access to it, right? So for example, if I own my house, I want to make sure I have exclusive rights to that someone else can't just come in and, start, cooking in my kitchen and sleeping in my house without my permission, that it can't just be taken from me by the government or anything like that. We want to make sure that those property rights are also enforceable so that someone can't legally steal or take from you. And we see that whenever this does happen, whenever someone might steal or take something from someone, legal action can be pursued. And we see that happen in court, sometimes in small claims court too, or whatever it might be. And we also see that they should be transferable. And this is really what we start to see happen within markets, because if you think about it, property rights being exchanged happens in markets all the time. Whenever a store sells me a product, when they sell me that product, they're transferring the rights to that product from themselves, who originally owns it and has the rights to sell it, to me, because once I buy it, I now possess it. And so we need to make sure property rights exist within a market, because without those property rights existing, markets can't really exist, because when it comes to buying and selling, there can't be that exchange or that transfer of the good or of the resources. When we're talking about here the transfer of the goods or resources, we do kind of say goods and resources for different reasons, because we need to understand, when it comes to goods and resources being exchanged within a market, how do all these pieces work together to just let the economy keep going and keep flowing? And we see that in the circular flow of economic activity. And what the circular flow of economic activity does is it shows us how businesses interact with individuals and vice versa. Now, as we already have sort of mentioned, you can interact with a business in really one of two ways. You can interact with them through the buying and selling of goods, as we mentioned, and that takes place in the product market. So in the product market, we see that that's just anywhere where the buying and selling of goods and services is happening. And so if you think about it, who is the buyer and who's the seller of goods and services? Well, businesses are the buyer. So businesses, they send those goods and services from themselves to us. So businesses produce goods and services. We buy those goods and services from the business. But once again, you can't just walk into a store and take something off the shelves and not pay for it, right? Because of those property rights. And so what we see is that we must pay for those goods and services. Now, we view that payment as consumer spending. Businesses might view that money as a little something else, because they're not on the giving end, they're on the receiving end. So they view that money as their business income. But as I had mentioned, these property rights, we said it doesn't just exist with goods, but we also said resources, because we see resources can also be transferred. And the transfer of resources takes place in something known as the resource, or sometimes known as the factor market. So we said within market economies, individuals are the ones who own or possess the factors of production. And I think the easiest one for you to understand is maybe your labor. You own your labor, and you get to choose how much you work, where you work, when you work, those types of things. Now, what we end up seeing is that because individuals own the resources, but it's businesses who combine those resources to make goods and services, individuals will sell the factors of production to businesses. Now, once again, you're not just going to show up to work for free, right? You're not just going to go to work and provide your labor, you expect money in return. And so we see a flow the opposite direction of money. And so businesses, how do they view this money that they have to pay for those factors of production? Well, they just view it as their production costs. Individuals, on the other hand, we don't view that as a cost for us. That's money we're earning. So we call that our personal income. So when you combine these two parts together, like we had mentioned, both the market for goods and the market for resources, we have this circular flow. And what I want us to see with this circular flow is that, first of all, there are two flows. You can see the inside flow first. That's a flow of money, right? And on the outside, you see, I kind of like to just call it the flow of stuff, goods and services and factors of production. But if you notice, those flows go in different directions. And they go in different directions because there's always an exchange occurring. We talked about that with the transferability of resources and goods when it comes to property rights. There needs to be a transfer and exchange happening. And so we see money is exchanged for goods and services or factors of production. And we can see how this kind of, our lives are lived out through this, right? As individuals, we provide the factors of production to firms and businesses who then take those factors of production and combine them in some way to make goods and services, which they sell to us as individuals, who then live out our daily lives to provide the factors of production, and the flow just keeps going. In the same way with money, right? We spend money on goods and services. That money comes into businesses as their income. They use that income to buy more resources to make more stuff. We receive that money that they're paying for those resources as our income, which we then use to spend on goods and services, and the flow just keeps going. I also kind of like to think about this in this way of just kind of looking at what exactly is the role of each player in each market, right? So for example, we say individuals, we act as the buyers of goods and services in the product market. Firms and businesses act as the seller of goods and services. And so you can see within that market, it's the interaction with goods and services, but we are the buyer, businesses are the seller. Now, when it comes to the factor market, we end up seeing individuals, we sell the factors of production, like your labor, and businesses, on the other hand, they buy the factors of production, right? And so we can see that each one has kind of like the opposite role in opposite markets. Now, Unit 2, our big focus is going to be here on the product market, just because it's an easier one to understand. Yeah, we will allude to the factor market from time to time, but the factor market is actually the focus of Unit 5 within AP Microeconomics. So we're going to be spending some time there on Unit 5 discussing those factor or resource markets more in depth. So like we said, since we're spending most of our time within the product market, we said we as individuals, we're the buyers. Now, another way we can refer to that is we are the demanders. And so that's going to be a word we see come up a lot in this course. Demand just means the quantity of a product that consumers are willing and able to purchase across a range of prices. And just so you know, that willing and able, both of those parts are equally as important here. Because first of all, you have to be, in order to be considered a demander, you have to be willing to purchase something, right? So for example, there's a lot of things that I might be able to purchase, like I have the money to buy it, but I'm just not willing to. I don't want it. I don't like the product. I don't need the product. And so I'm not a demander for it because, yeah, I might have the funds, but I'm not willing. Now, able is the other part because there's a lot of things I'd be willing to buy, right? Like there's a lot of really cool sports cars out there. A private island would be pretty sweet. Right now, I'm not able to purchase those. And so we need to see that both willing and able are there in order to be considered a demander. So let's take a look at an example. So let's say we look at Mr. Bradley's demand for boxes of cereal, right? Now, what I have here is what's known as a demand schedule. And so the demand schedule shows us at every single price point, what is the amount of cereal that Mr. Bradley would be willing to purchase. And so we have a couple different points there, and we're going to go ahead and plot those points out. So if we plot those points out on our graph here to the right, you can see that we have kind of these points, they look linear, and they're also downward sloping. And so if we connect those, that gives us something known as our demand curve. Talking a little bit more about the demand curve, though, we need to first see a trait that you all might notice is that because it's downward sloping, what this means is there's an inverse relationship between our two axes, right? Price and quantity. And that's known as the law of demand. Price decreases, quantity demanded increases. As price increases, quantity demanded decreases. This is something y'all know, right? Like if something gets cheaper, you want to buy more of it. As something gets more expensive, you want to buy less of it. And we see that's the case here for Bradley, right? Like when cereal's really, really cheap, like down there at 50 cents, yeah, load up on cereal, go buy a whole bunch. But when cereal gets more expensive, Mr. Bradley's less willing and able to purchase cereal. Now, why is that? Well, there's a couple of different reasons we can point to when it comes to demand for why this is the case. The first one is the idea of diminishing marginal utility. And this has come up before as we talked about, diminishing marginal benefit, or however you want to look at it. But just the idea that, that first box of cereal, because we're willing to pay $4 for that first box of cereal, it provides us with at least $4 worth of benefit. But since the idea of diminishing marginal utility exists, like that second one isn't going to be as delicious. I'm not going to be as hungry. So I'm not going to be willing to pay the same amount for a second box as I would the first one. So that first one I'm willing to pay for, but I'm not willing to buy two at $4, right? The price would have to go down in order for me to buy a second. I'm willing to buy one box, but not a second. Now, if the price was to go down to maybe $3.50, well, that second box of cereal provides me with at least $3.50 worth of benefit, but a third, because I would get even less benefit from a third, wouldn't provide me with as much as the second nor the first. So I'm willing to buy two boxes at $3.50, but in order for me to buy a third box would have to be even cheaper. And so we can see that I'm only going to keep buying more and more cereal if that cereal gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Another one we can look to is the idea of the income effect. So let's just say, hypothetically, I have a cereal budget, right? Like that I only spend so much money on cereal. As the price of cereal decreases, as cereal gets cheaper and goes on sale, my buying power, meaning like my cereal budget, it increases. The ability for my cereal budget to be able to buy more cereal, right? So maybe I spend, like $10 a week on cereal. If the price of cereal is $3, well, my $10 is only going to allow me to buy 3 boxes of cereal, right? That $10 can only get me 3 full boxes of cereal. If the price of cereal goes down to $2, well, dang, now at a price of $2, I can buy a lot more cereal. Now, that $10 is going to allow me to buy 5 boxes. And we call it the income effect, and even though our income is not changing, it feels like it has because our income now goes further. The buying power, the purchasing power of it increases. We also see the substitution effect in play. As prices decrease, buyers are going to shift their money away from other goods and toward this cheaper good. Maybe also for breakfast, I often buy, eggs and bacon. But let's say cereal starts to get cheaper. Well, I might look at that and say, eggs and bacon are delicious, but they're like relatively expensive compared to cereal right now. Cereal is a cheaper alternative, so maybe I should shift some of my money away from buying bacon and eggs and shift it toward buying more cereal since cereal is now cheaper. One thing we want to understand as we get into supply and demand is that supply and demand curves can be represented as linear functions. Now, one thing I want to point out quick, first of all, these next couple slides are not in your notes. It is also beyond the scope of the testing in this course. However, I always like to make sure that you understand connections between this course and other classes you might take in, so you can apply some of those same skills and ideas to help better understand these ideas. So if you kind of get through this and you're like, hey, no clue what was going on there, that's okay. Because like I said, this is beyond the scope of the testing, but I think it might help you better understand how we can look at and perceive demand curves and supply curves. Because if you look over here, like this demand curve that we have drawn on our graph, it is just a line. And like you guys know the equation for a line. Let's say the function here is Q, quantity, equals 90 minus 20p. Now, we'll get into this a little bit later, but if you notice the x and the y here are switched the way it looks like in that function. I'll explain that more in a second. Now, whenever we think about demand versus quantity demanded, when you hear the word demand is the entire function or the entire curve. So that Q equals 90 minus 20p, that is the demand. It gives us an entire line, and it shows us at every single price how much of a product is our market willing to purchase. We also have quantity demanded, though, and quantity demanded is a specific point along the curve. Or if we look at our function, what we're doing is we're taking a specific price and plugging that price in for P. And when we plug that in and we do 90 minus 20p, whatever that P is, it will result in a specific Q. And that specific Q represents a specific point along our curve. Now, what then happens, though, when either the demand or the quantity demanded changes? Now, whenever there's a change in demand is shown as a shift of the entire curve. So like the language here, you need to make sure you understand. A change in demand, the entire curve is moving in space. It's either shifting to the left or to the right. okay? To the left is a decrease, to the right is an increase. And this is caused by some what we call non-price determinant. We're going to have an acronym, BICEPS, to understand and know these. But we're going to see there's also a change in quantity demanded. Since quantity demanded is just one specific point, a change in quantity demanded is just movement from one specific point to another specific point along the curve. The only thing, by the way, that causes a change in quantity demanded is a change in the price of the good itself, which should make sense, right? Because if you look at that function up top, if we have some price that we've plugged in for P, and then we change what that P is, it's going to take us to a different Q along our curve. Now, looking at this a little bit further, I had mentioned to you that, like, for the most part, it's like we think about demand. Which one is the independent and which one is the dependent variable? And typically we see, you know, like the X, whatever's on our X-axis, that is our independent variable, and our Y, that is the dependent variable. In economics, price is the independent variable, quantity is the dependent variable. So therefore you can see the axes are switched from conventional thinking. This actually traces its way back to like the 1800s, whenever there was a guy, I think it was Alfred Marshall, wrote this. It's kind of one of the first economics textbooks. He flipped these axes, and it's just kind of been the way it is. But we have to also kind of understand it, because it's like, okay, well, what determines what, you know? And we typically say that the price of something determines the amount of something we're willing and able to purchase, right? So for example, for the example with cereal, you know, the price of cereal will determine how much of that cereal I'm willing and able to purchase. Now, again, there's arguments for like, oh, well, it's the quantity, how much people want to buy, that's going to determine the price. And there's arguments there. But for the most part, a lot of the thinking is that, yes, it's the price that first determines what is going to be the amount of a product that people are willing and able to buy. So if we look at this function again, that Q represents the quantity demanded, right? Now, let's say that we said there's a change in quantity demand is caused by a change in price. Why is that? Well, again, let's say we plug in some specific price. Let's say we plug in the price of $2.50, and you do 90 minus 250, and it spits out a quantity of 40. And we see that that point sits along our curve, right? It sits along our demand curve. It's a specific point on our demand curve. But let's change the price. Let's again, we're not changing anything in the function. We're just changing the price, the input that we have here. And so let's change it to 150. So 90 minus 20 times 150, that gets us 60. And so if you notice, as our price decreases, it moves us to a different point down along our curve. So decreasing that price increases the quantity demanded. That's that inverse relationship. And again, we didn't change the function. All we did was enter a different input, which then resulted in a different output, right? We changed the price that we put in, our independent variable, yeah, and it spit out a different dependent variable, that Y, the quantity. Now, a change in demand, as we said, results in a different quantity at every point, shifting the entire curve. So again, let's say we have this function, but we're saying something happens to the function. It's not the price necessarily changing, but it's something that happens to the function that impacts the entire function, okay? So a change in demand, we said, is caused by something that's not related to the price. So we said it's not the price changing. So like maybe we just put in a specific price there, and we plug that in, and it gets us, a quantity of 30. But then let's suppose something happens to our function. Something happens to our constant, right? Because normally we say things are typically constant within a market, but let's say something that is normally constant changes. So here we change our constant within the function. Let's say we change that 90 to a 70. And as we change that, we plug that in, and it results in a quantity of 10. So if you notice, it's now a different point that's not on our curve. And so it's not just true here at this point, but it's true at all prices. Like if we were to plug in for both of those different ones at all prices, it would result in an entirely new set of points, and that entirely new set of points would be an entirely new line. Now again, if you notice, this is a shift up and right. As we shift this constant, it's not moving our function up and down as we might be used to, because remember, since our axes are switched, up and down is now instead left and right. All right, so back to in your notes. Changing quantity demanded, again, sort of like we just said, it's a movement from one specific point to another specific point along the demand curve. And we said it's caused by a change in price, just changing that P that we're inputting. So again, looking at this demand for cereal, we have our demand curve here. And let's suppose, again, that the price of cereal, say, starts off at $3.50. And at a price of $3.50, let's suppose that people demand 20 boxes of cereal within our economy. Now, Once that price decreases, so it's the price that is changing, as a result of a lower price, what we end up seeing is now people would like to buy more cereal. The law of demand tells us as cereal gets cheaper, people want to buy more of it, right? And as a result, our demand curve has not moved, but we have moved points along our demand curve. We've moved down along our demand curve here. But when it comes to a change in demand, a change in the entire curve, again, this is a shift either to the left or to the right of the entire curve, we're saying the quantity demanded changes at each price, right? So that specific point changes at every single price, giving us an entirely new set of points. And this is caused by something known as a non-price determinant. It is a determinant, a thing that is shifting the entire curve that is not related to the price at all. And we'll talk about what those things are here in a second. So once again, let's suppose we have this set of points that gives us our demand curve, but let's say that something happens within our market where the price of cereal doesn't change, but now all of a sudden, people are willing to buy more cereal at every price. So now at $4.50, they're willing to buy 30 boxes. At $3.50, they're willing to buy 50. At $2.50, they're now willing to buy 70. So they're willing to buy more cereal at every single price. Price hasn't changed, they're just willing to buy more. Well, if we take those points and plot them out, it gives us an entirely new line that is off to the right. And what that rightward shift represents is that now people are demanding more cereal at every single price point. But what is it that's going to cause an increase or a decrease in our whole demand curve? And so we're going to talk about these things, like we said, the determinants of demand, the things that will cause these shifts of demand. And first, let's talk about what causes an increase in demand. Well, we have an acronym here to help us remember the things that cause those shifts, and that acronym is going to be BICEPS. The first one's pretty easy to understand. It's a change in the number of buyers. So say that, 20,000 people move to town overnight. Well, yeah, if there's more people around, there's going to be an increased demand for cereal, right? People are going to buy more cereal. People are going to buy more of everything. So more buyers means there's going to be more demand. The I represents a change in income. Now, income, when income changes, we need to be careful because different goods react in different ways. So we have two different types of goods. Most goods are what we call normal goods, where what that means is as our income increases for normal goods, we demand more of that good. Like most of those goods are that way, right? We make more money, we buy more of that good. But some goods are known as inferior goods, and our demand for inferior goods would increase if our income decreases. So income decreases for inferior goods, resulting in an increase in demand. Well, what does that mean? Well, an inferior good is typically like a cheaper alternative or a generic or something like that, where what that's saying is that, okay, we start making less money. And it might be one of those things where it's like, oh man, like I can't afford the name brand, the on brand, like the best version anymore. I need to opt for a cheaper alternative instead. And so now I'm going to start buying more of that cheaper alternative. That's why my demand for the cheaper alternative increases, or my income decreases, my demand for that inferior good increases. C is a decrease in the price of a complement. Remember, complements are things we buy together. So a complement for cereal is milk, right? If milk gets cheaper, right, there's a decrease in the price of milk, the demand for cereal will increase. Notice that that's not the price of cereal changing. That's the price of some other good changing, but it results in a changed demand for cereal. So, right, the price of milk gets cheaper. We want to buy more milk, and as a result, we're also going to buy more cereal. E is a change in expectations. If we expect prices to increase in the future, it's going to increase our demand now. Maybe you hear that the price of cereal is going to go up next week. Well, if you know the price of cereal is going up next week, right? Like you're going to go and you're going to buy and load up on cereal today. Maybe another example you might be able to relate to is like if you get an alert saying that gas prices are expected to go up, next week or tomorrow, you better believe that right away you're going and you're filling up your tank with gas. Now, again, the price has not yet changed, but what we expect to happen, the price has changed. A change in preferences. This can just be, things you like, things you don't like. Maybe I start eating more cereal and I realize, oh my gosh, cereal is the best thing ever invented. So I want to buy more cereal as a result. Maybe I change in preferences. Maybe I start waking up earlier and I got time for breakfast. I'm like, oh, I got time for breakfast now. I need to start buying breakfast items. So I'm going to start buying more cereal. Maybe I, just start liking a brand of cereal more. All these things that might change our preferences. And there's a wide variety of things that would fall into that category. And then finally, an increase in the price of a substitute. So maybe a substitute for cereal is, like we were talking earlier, eggs and bacon. And let's say eggs and bacon start to get more expensive. Well, if eggs and bacon start getting more expensive, I'm going to be like, you know what? I can't afford eggs and bacon anymore. I'm going to stop, having eggs and bacon for breakfast. And instead, I'm just going to start buying more cereal to have for breakfast instead. So that's biceps. Buyers, income, complements, expectations, preferences, and substitutes. Again, none of those are the price changing, but all of them are things that change that then cause our demand for, in this case, cereal, to move. Not the price, but some other thing that is normally constant that is changing and impacting our market. We also have decrease in demand, and we have the exact same things here for a decrease in demand for biceps. It's just the opposite of all those. So for B, it'd be a decrease in the number of buyers. Everybody moves out of town. A bunch of people move out of town overnight. No one's buying cereal anymore, or not as many people are buying cereal anymore, we should say. Change in income, once again, and we said again, depending on if it's a normal or an inferior good, it matters. If our income decreases, we're going to buy less. We're going to buy less cereal, right? So our income decreases, and we're going to buy less cereal if we consider cereal a normal good. If our income increases, we're actually going to decrease our demand for inferior goods. And what this is saying is maybe before I was buying these cheaper alternatives, but I start making more money and I'm like, oh, sweet. I don't got to buy the cheap brand anymore. I can buy the name brand, right? I can buy the good stuff. And so I'm going to start buying the better version. And so I'm going to decrease my demand for the inferior type, the inferior good, because I'm going to start buying a different one instead because I'm making more money. C is an increase in the price of a complement. If milk gets more expensive, we're buying less milk. We're buying less milk. We're also buying less cereal, right? E is consumers expect the price to decrease in the future. If you get an ad and you find out that cereal's going on sale next week, right? You're like, oh, cereal's on sale next week. Well, I shouldn't buy cereal today then. I should wait a couple days to buy cereal when it's cheaper in the future. If I expect cereal to go down in price later, I'm going to decrease my demand right now because I expect the price to be cheaper in the future and I'd rather buy it then. A change in preferences, again, wide variety of things. Maybe I just don't like cereal anymore. Maybe I had a bad cereal experience or I don't want to buy cereal anymore. I don't know, something like that. But it can go for a wide variety of things. A study comes out that cereal is bad for you. I don't know. That could decrease people's demand. It's changing their preferences, those types of things. And then finally, a decrease in the price of a substitute. If eggs and bacon start to get cheaper, right? I'm like, hey, cool, eggs and bacon, great breakfast option. I'm going to start buying more eggs and bacon. If I'm buying more eggs and bacon, though, I'm probably not going to be buying as much cereal.